Okay, Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
There's a lot that I want to ask you, and let's start with your childhood. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
So I was born in a place called Ulsan, Korea. It used to be a fairly small fishing town when I was born, which is 1970. Now it's evolved into really modern. I think it's like the wealthiest city in Korea or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
But so I basically lived mostly outside of Seoul when I was a little kid. So many of my memories from Korea are Ulsan, Busan, which are these like seaside cities
I
or
see.
towns,
Yeah.
and really rural, not super rural, but somewhat kind of provincial type towns. And then towards the end of my time in Korea, I moved to Seoul, and I was there for a little bit before we left Korea. So I actually speak Korean with a regional accent, and for my concept of what Korea is in my mind is from that time, like 1970s regional Korea.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, how old were you when you left?
So I was like 7 or 8 when I left Korea, and we then went to Costa Rica. Yeah.
I see. Wow. How was that transition like?
So it was shocking because back then in Korea, it was a military dictatorship under General Park Chung-hee,
That's right.
and everything was really strict in school. So like my class in Korea had like 100 kids, and I think there was like no heating in the school or something like
Oh,
that.
boy.
Almost like when I describe it, people think it's like they imagine it like in black and white,
Yeah.
and I kind of remember it in black and white. But and they would regularly just beat you if you did anything wrong, but they would bring you to the front of the classroom and beat you with a stick. The teacher would, while
Oh,
everybody
boy.
watched you.
Oh my gosh.
And every classroom had this photograph of General Park Chung-hee, and
Really?
yeah, in the front, like this massive photograph. And he had this habit of kind of taking a photo like slightly to the side,
Yeah.
so that his shoulders were a little bit turned and he would look down. So literally, when you were being beaten and you looked up at the photograph, I remember it looked like he was looking at you
Oh my
while you were being beaten. So
That's
to
scary.
go from that environment to, I think my first day in Costa Rica, at the end of the day, they started playing salsa merengue music over the loudspeaker, and all the little kids like grabbed each other and started doing salsa merengue, which I just found like just mind blowing. It's like being transported to a different planet.
Wow. How did your parents decide to immigrate to Costa Rica?
So we actually didn't immigrate. What happened was my dad was working for a Korean company called Daewoo at the time,
I see.
and he kind of went overseas on an assignment. But went to Dubai, which at the time had almost nothing in it.
Right.
Not like today. So it really didn't have schools even. So because we wanted to live overseas, and also at the time, there was a fear that there was going to be another Korean War. And
Oh,
my parents,
right.
who had both lived through the Korean War,
That's right.
were really paranoid about it. So in conjunction with the overseas posting, they thought it'd be good if my mom and I could also leave the country, at least temporarily.
Yeah.
And I have cousins in Costa Rica, so we went to live there while my dad worked in Dubai.
Wow.
And then we thought we were all going to go back to Korea, but eventually it ended up not happening.
And then you moved to the United States. How old were you?
So I was probably about 13 when I came to the U.S. So I went from Costa Rica to Dubai,
Yeah.
and I lived in Dubai for a little bit.
Oh,
and
wow.
then I came to the U.S.
So how did your childhood experience of like constantly moving to different places and having to adjust to new culture affect you when you were growing up?
So a couple of things. I think first, it's common for people to say, oh, I had difficulties in childhood, so therefore I achieved a lot. I actually am very grateful that my parents always took really good care of me, and I grew up basically middle class.
Right.
So I really felt like I had pretty much everything I needed. Now, I didn't have like huge like luxury needs, and we didn't like do that many expensive things or anything, but I didn't really have any kind of actual hardship in the sense of material hardship.
Right. Right.
But I was like incredibly irritated pretty much my entire childhood because either I didn't know any of the kids. I moved every 2 years on average until I got to college.
Wow.
So either I didn't know everybody, or I couldn't speak the language, or I remember like I had these like funny clothes that my mom brought from Korea because she didn't want to spend money, so she just had like cheap clothes from Korea sent over, and I was just like look completely crazy wearing like
Yeah.
70s Korean clothes, not being able to speak the language because I spoke primarily Korean and then Spanish.
Right.
So especially I would say Costa Rica had some racism, but it wasn't like really virulent racism. It's more like slight xenophobia. And
see.
Dubai didn't really have much because mostly you were with expats. But certainly when I came to the U.S., I think my first port of entry was Miami.
I see.
And there were just all kinds of race issues back then, as there still are today.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was, I would say, in terms of trying to fit in with new people and adjust and feeling like kind of an outsider, that pretty much was the theme until I got to college.
Wow. So tell me about your parents. Did they want you to be something, particular job or career when you grew up? How was their parenting style?
This is probably anybody out there who's Korean, who's listening to this, will be extremely envious of the following, which is my parents never pressured me to do anything.
Really?
Yeah.
But you became who most parents want you to be.
Oh,
Right?
I guess, I don't know. But, well, I think I'm very grateful that they never pressured me to do anything. And I think probably the reason they never pressured me to do anything is they themselves are not your typical kind of Korean who was from like a super educated class in Korea and then immigrated, and then they ended up having hardship in the U.S. and wanting to kind of live out all of their fantasies of U.S. success by pressuring their kids to achieve new things.
Right, right.
So I'm not really a Korean American, like your traditional, like, oh, we moved to the U.S. to live in the U.S. We just kind of ended up here.
Right.
I guess sort of like a 1.5 or some hybrid. So my parents are from like a very humble background. They're both from rural areas, like really rural areas. Originally from a place called Gangwon-do, which is where now the Olympics are.
That's right.
But back then it was like a really kind of pretty downtrodden area of Korea. And then in their 20s, they moved to Busan independently and met there.
I see.
My dad was, at the time he got married, a nighttime boiler repairman at the local power plant.
Interesting.
And
Wow.
my mom was a hairdresser at the
Wow.
local market. So these are like very, very plain blue-collar people. Eventually, through a whole series of lucky breaks, my dad got into some management, and that's how we ended up at Daewoo.
I see.
But because of that background, pretty much like anything I did was going to be an achievement.
I
and
see.
so they never really pressured me to do anything. And as long as I wasn't like going around doing anything bad, they were just always like either praising me or just happy that I was doing something.
Wow. Do you think your parents understand the level of success you've achieved?
Well, I guess I think they think I'm successful because in that generation of Koreans,
Yeah.
having like being in a legal profession is considered very successful or very prestigious. Being like at the top of an organization is considered really important. Having a good income is considered important. So I think in their definition of success, I'm successful, and I think they're very happy with it.
Right.
Now, I think if you drew a Venn diagram between their definition of success and my definition of success, there's like some overlap. So I think they see just their circle, and then I really just see my circle. And so there's some common elements I think we both share, both think, oh, this is successful. But I think they think I'm successful, but for reasons that are different from how I think I haven't really achieved. Sounds like you've actually gotten what you wanted, but that I've at least like chasing success and kind of catching it, but not completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so what is your definition of success?
So I think it's evolved over time. I've articulated it differently throughout my life, but now I've kind of reached, I guess, my late 40s. I realized I was actually saying the same thing the entire time with different words, which is to really be able to do what I want without other people messing with me. So I think that's really how I define success.
Pretty much what everybody wants, right?
Yeah, deep down, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So let's go back to your childhood. When you're growing up, did you have a childhood dream?
Well, I think originally, when I was in Korea, I didn't really have any sort of big career goals. I think that eventually, when I came to the U.S., I think I felt so kind of ostracized by the Americans, at least the nativist Americans who were very kind of racist or very exclusionary, that I think I really thought, if I went into the U.S. military, and I became a career military, that I would be really integrated with this country. So for a time, I was obsessed with joining the U.S. military and having a career of it, which would have been a mistake to have a whole career in it. But that was probably one goal I had. Another time in my life, I actually, that transmuted to wanting to be in foreign service or in the intelligence services and traveling the world and things of that sort. But I think eventually I really just settled on law, probably freshman year in college.
I see.
And I've really had that as my primary interest since then.
How did that come about? How did you first develop an interest in law?
So kind of like a transmutation of why I wanted to be a career soldier and eventually maybe like a career CIA or State Department official, which is feeling like integrated with the U.S. And even though we didn't really go through that much hardship, I think that the whole process of immigration made me really feel like I really wanted to get sort of insight into how the U.S. legal system worked and insight into really how to really be an insider in the U.S.
Yeah.
So, there are little things like my mom used to work at a laundromat when we first moved here as a worker. We didn't own one. And the customers are constantly abusing her and like saying racist things to her, and she'd get really upset.
Right.
And just seeing things like that just kind of like made me feel like, oh, I really want to have stability and a sense of being like part of the mainstream so that I'm not looked down upon. So I thought, well, law is really going to get me that. So I wasn't like academically interested in law. I thought it would be something that would kind of give me that insider status and knowledge of how to get things done. But it turned out I actually do like the law intellectually, and it also let me kind of travel internationally, which is what I realized my true deep interest was. Yeah.
Sounds like your desire to be integrated or accepted or become an insider in this country really drove you to this profession. And
Yeah, initially, that's right.
And also you did serve in the military,
Yeah,
right?
just thankfully not as a career. Yeah.
How was that like?
I really enjoyed it actually.
Yeah.
I was in the U.S. Army. I was an infantry enlisted and then officer, and really made really great friends. And I think I really enjoy the feeling of challenge and physical activity. So it got me all that.
Yeah. I know you had different business ideas before co-founding this law firm. Can you share with us what ideas you had?
Yeah, so we really, Steve Kobre and I, the other co-founder, we really just love business. And initially, one of the ideas that we explored was diapers for dogs. So we'd walk around and we'd see like all these dogs basically pooping in the street and people having to clean it up. It's kind of gross.
Right.
And so we thought, how great would it be if you could just make diapers and they could just put it on the dog and then just throw it away at the end. So I looked into this quite a bit, and it had a lot of logistical challenges. I mean, all these dogs, unlike like human babies, that their diapers only come in a couple of sizes.
Right.
Human babies are like within a narrow range of like pelvic size.
Yeah.
But dogs, even though it's like one category dog, there's a huge variety of sizes and shapes in terms of dogs, right? So you had like dogs with like tiny butts and then dogs with like really weirdly shaped pelvic sizes.
Right.
And so the sheer variety of models you needed to have was hard.
I see.
And also doing it in Manhattan is hard because most places you go in the world, people just keep one of a couple of types of dogs, or 2 or 3 types of dogs are common. But in Manhattan, because you have so much racial and ethnic diversity and people from all over the world, you have like an incredible range of dog butts in Manhattan. So that was complicated. The intellectual property threshold was very low. So as soon as you made any money, everybody else would just come and copy it. You couldn't really do that much about it.
I see.
So I had all these dreams of becoming a dog diaper king and putting like my face and Steve Kobre's face on the back with like, smiling or whatever, but it just became too complicated. But even to this day, when I actually see dogs, I actually am very interested in their pelvis and sort of what it would be like to put my diaper on it. So anyway.
Well, to this day, it doesn't exist.
Actually, I have seen it in a few different places.
Oh,
I think in
have?
Korea you can actually buy it.
Interesting.
Yeah. But a lot of people don't really buy it. I'm not sure why.
I
So.
see. They probably don't know like how to use it,
Yeah.
or probably don't know it exists, right?
Yeah, you should probably delete this part of the interview so that I can keep this a trade secret, and then eventually, after I retire from a law firm, I'll go back to my dream.
Okay, sounds good. So, Steve, Kobre, and you were colleagues at Department of Justice working as prosecutors, right?
Yeah.
And while you were working on these very complicated legal cases, you were talking about creating diapers for dogs?
Yeah, and then, among other things, and eventually we settled on a law firm
I see.
because we figured just stick with what you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you could have had a very comfortable life, continuing to work at the Department of Justice. Prior to that, you were an associate at a very big law firm. So why did you decide to start a law firm?
So I think part of it is the particular U.S. Attorney's office I was in. Most people leave after 3 to 6 years.
Ah, got it.
And they go back to large firms. So maybe another way for me to think about the issue is, why didn't I go to a large firm afterwards, like most of my colleagues? And I think it's that I had a really deep interest in business, and I really wanted just the excitement of seeing if my business ideas would work out. And I figured I was only like 31 at the time, so I figured even if I basically went bankrupt, it wouldn't be that bad because I would still have the rest of my life to make all the money back.
Right.
So I took a second mortgage on my house
Wow.
to start it. It actually only cost $50,000 to start it, but I didn't actually have it. So
Wow. So you borrowed $50,000.
right, and Steve Kobre got $50,000, and that was the beginning of the firm.
Wow.
And I think I guess if you've never seen or heard of any kind of actual real hardship, not that I've actually experienced that much hardship myself, but I think depending on your frame of reference, if you think taking a second mortgage, investing in a business when you're 31, and then it not working out is like the worst possible thing in your life, and then you're kind of off track or whatever it is that you convince yourself is going to happen to you, then I think it must be very intimidating to think, well, what if I fail? I'm going to ruin my life, or however dramatically you can think about it. But if you change your frame of reference and you think, like, what's the worst possible thing that could happen? Is that I was going to lose my $50,000 and maybe file personal bankruptcy, but that was unlikely to. I could just go get a job somewhere. I think the real the real concern in that scenario is, realistically, the worst case scenario was not bad. It's more that most people who work really hard, and especially people who are children of immigrants of places like Korea that value institutional credentials and
That's right.
pedigree, et cetera, the fear isn't so much like, oh, it's not going to work out and I'll be like homeless or whatever. That's not going to happen. It's more, you think you're supposed to walk a path of exceedingly greater achievement
That's right.
as defined by the next thing you're supposed to want. And you're afraid that if you fall off of it, that A, you won't be able to get back on it, and B, you never really knew what you wanted anyway. So now you're sort of in this category of people who are aimless, that you're afraid of where you're going to end up. So I think it was, if you don't have clear goals of what you want in your life, it doesn't have to be some grandiose goal. It could be like, you want to be able to do X a year from now. You want to have a certain situation, 3 years from now, or whatever it is. Unless you have goals like that, I think you end up just adopting other people's definition of what your goal should be. And you also become extremely risk averse, because your downside becomes not just what the downside I described, which most people could tolerate. You lose your investment, and then you can just go get some job, maybe not as good of a job as if you'd never done it, but then you can work your way back up. But it just becomes all this psychological pressure of, what if I fall off the track? I don't even know what I want, and I'm going to be in this category of people who are not successful and off track, and then I don't know what's going to happen to me. So I think lack of goals really creates risk aversity, which then in turn creates the inability to pursue your goals. It's like a terrible vicious cycle that most people, I would say, don't even realize is actually happening to them.
That's right. And especially as a kid of immigrant who parents, I'm sure, worked really hard to provide for you, and especially surrounded by so many lawyers who are risk averse. They are lawyers because they're afraid to take a risk.
Yeah.
How did your family and friends react when you said, I'm going to leave this job and go become an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so they were happy about me leaving the government because I wasn't making any money.
I see.
But I think the big shock was that I wouldn't go to a big Wall Street law firm.
Right.
And I would say my parents reacted the same way they always react, which is they're just generally pretty mellow and happy with
Yeah.
what I do. I would say the most interesting thing was I went and talked to significant number of people I respect
I
who
see.
were more experienced lawyers and asked them their opinion. And I would say 99% of them told me it was a terrible idea, that I would end up doing stupid little cases the rest of my life and throwing away everything I worked so hard to achieve, like the
Wow.
Harvard credentials, being at a big Wall Street law firm, being at a U.S. Attorney's office in Manhattan, which was a great credential, that all that, this is the moment you're supposed to be paid off, you're supposed to get the reward for all that hard work, and now you're going to throw it all away and end up in the same situation as somebody who, went to a third-rate school, who didn't really work, that type of thing that ends up preying on people's insecurities if you never had a goal in the first place,
Right.
and you're defined by your credentials. I
Right.
heard from virtually everybody.
So why did you still do it?
Because I think they all meant well, but I think they really didn't know. None of them really knew what would happen.
They've
Neither
never
did
done
I.
it- they've never done it before, right?
Right, and neither did I.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they were able to predict what was going to happen.
Right.
And again, it's basically like, what do you really want? It's goal clarity, being honest with
Yeah.
yourself about what's most important to you.
Right.
And for me, it was, I actually had a lot of faith that the business could work. And even if it didn't, I actually think I wasn't really that afraid of the downside. I knew that if I never tried it, that this would nag at me,
Right.
and this was the right time to try it. So based on my goals, it was really the only thing to do.
Wow. I think that a lot when a lot of other people tell us that you can't do it, it's not going to work out for you, it's often that they're projecting their own insecurities on us. And maybe if they were us, they wouldn't try it, but they are not us, so they wouldn't know until we try. We don't even know until we try, right?
Yeah, and many
Yeah.
people want to rationalize why they did what they did. And so it's pretty rare they'll say, well, I think I made the wrong choices. I think you should, I wish I did what you're doing. Pretty
I
rare
see.
that happens. And I would say the other phenomenon that happens is that if you're somebody who, again, gets your goals defined by other people, even unbeknownst to you, then if a lot of people say something's a bad idea, it may be that if you understand their reason and you're persuaded by it, you agree with it. But if it's just that they're concluding it's a bad idea and pushing their opinion on you, you can become very afraid of it because you think, oh, I only feel validation if I'm doing something that people have said is good or right. But I have kind of a personality where if I am trying to do something where I think it's innovative and I'm going to get something out of it, money, freedom, whatever, the more people that say, I've never thought about it, or that sounds weird, or are skeptical about it, the more I'm convinced that it's either really dumb or brilliant. It's one of the two, right?
Interesting.
And I figure if I try enough of those things,
Yeah.
by luck, I'll end up with some brilliant. You only need one or two brilliant
That's
to
right.
really change the course of your life,
Yeah.
right? So I think, by definition, if most people either don't understand it or are skeptical about it, that's really where opportunity lies. Nobody got wealthy doing the safest thing at every turn.
Right.
If you look at every single person who ever achieved anything unusual, they ended up doing something that most people either were skeptical about or hadn't thought about.
Right. So what you've just described is the spirit of entrepreneurship, right? Yet being a lawyer is very different from being an entrepreneur, right? A lot
Right.
of lawyers don't like to take a risk. So practicing law and being an entrepreneur and running your own business is very different. And you've never done this before. This was your first time. So how did you know what to do?
I didn't, actually. So, yeah, I'm still really learning.
Yeah.
It's because the business keeps evolving, the industry keeps evolving.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Kobre and I are constantly amazed at how many things we don't know and how challenging it is
Yeah.
to do this.
I heard when you first started out, Steve, and you sat down and you wrote down your goals and aspirations and visions for
Yeah.
the firm, and then you compared notes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons we've had such a great business partnership is, like me, he's very straightforward
I
with
see.
himself about what he wants and what he's willing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the thing, is that the list wasn't just like, oh, we want to be wealthy or we want to be respected. That's too vague. Like, obviously, if people wrote that down, everyone's definition of it is different. That's the problem. We're
Right.
very specific, And I think it was basically like, what we were willing to do. And I think we were willing to sacrifice everything. Now, one of the things we both agreed on that we had actually on our list is when we start this business, if not a single person called us for 2 years
Wow.
with any business whatsoever, we would shake hands. We'd just run out of money, so we'd have to stop the business at that
Right.
point. But we'd shake hands and we'd part as friends, and we would never say a negative word to each other the entire 2 years or thereafter about the venture.
Wow.
And we were prepared to do that psychologically.
Wow.
And we believed it.
Yeah.
And so it's, I think, clarity like that about, and then also, I think, if you have a goal, it's good to have clear goals, but I think it's really important to do 2 other things to achieve goals. First, I think when you say goal, it can't be vague and abstract. It's got to be very, very concrete, as specific as you can make it. Like, if it's weight loss, it's not I want to be lighter. It's I want to be X number of pounds, right?
I see.
Or if it's weightlifting, it can't be like I want to be stronger. It's going to be I want to bench press X number of pounds,
Right.
right? So the goal has to be as concrete as possible, so you can reverse engineer both what it takes, what you have to do to get it, and milestones of to actually get there, you have to progress at a certain rate. You have to hit certain milestones, otherwise you're not going to achieve it during that time. And a goal by definition has to have a time limit.
That's
Otherwise
right.
it's just a hope, not an actual goal, right? So I think what was helpful for us is not only did we have a goal with specific amounts of money and innovation, et cetera, but the 2 other things I think is first, we had the same milestones. We needed to achieve certain things, or we knew that we weren't progressing towards it. And I think when you set a goal, you have to basically discipline yourself. If the goal's 3 years away, you're not going to be able to discipline yourself. It has to be, if you want to be able to run a 4-minute mile 3 months from now, you have to be at a certain speed a month from now. Otherwise, you're not going to achieve your goal,
I
right?
see.
And then the second thing, which I think is the most important, which gets overlooked, is clarity about what you are willing to do.
Ah, got it. Not
Deep
just
down.
what you want.
Right, not just what you want, but how much are you willing to sacrifice other things
I
to
see.
achieve your goal?
I see.
And I think it's important to be clear with yourself about what everyone has limitations about what they're willing to do.
Right.
You can't say, I'm willing to do anything to achieve your goal, because I've never met anybody for whom that's actually true.
Right.
So you have to understand and articulate to yourself, I'm willing to do up to this point, but not beyond. And then you have to honestly ask yourself, is that actually going to achieve your goal? Then you either have to lower your goal or increase your effort. But the 2 have to
Interesting.
match up.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
for us, we were determined to not just start a law firm or a law practice that would mimic others, which we knew could be done at a
Right.
certain level, but we wanted to create something really innovative and really new. And we knew that there's a chance that we were totally wrong and we'd never be able to do it. And we may not have any of the innovative business we wanted. That's why we said to each other, I am prepared to literally, think about that psychologically, for 2 years not having an income, spending money every day, and literally not a single human being calls you.
Wow.
But
and you
we're-
thought of this in advance.
Yes, and we were prepared to do it.
Wow.
So that's why I think when we were trying to, we'd go into sales pitches, and most people you're pitching in a legal setting are in large institutions, or they
Right.
themselves are very credentialed.
Yeah.
So they look down on anything that's not like them.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, a lot of those people have been protected in large institutions and haven't really seen how money's made and how things actually work, like the deep guts of it.
Right.
They kind of go into these big offices where there's an institution already operating and they do a certain job and money magically appears in their account. So there's a certain disdain they have for people that they regard as kind of below them, meaning smaller institutions,
Right.
not having that type of credential. So our experience largely until many years later was constantly to go into sales pitches and be really treated with total disdain,
Wow.
right? Or basically sneer at.
But
right?
you're this Harvard grad who worked at this prestigious law firm, worked at the DOJ, and how was that like for you?
Well, I think, again, it's if you are confused about what your goal is, then I think I would have felt really bad. Because if my goal was to feel respected by other people for credentials, it would have made me feel bad.
Right.
But because I was in there prepared to literally not have a single person call for 2 years and spend all my money and go into bankruptcy, I figured that if I did 50 of these pitches and one became an actual case, I'm actually above where I was prepared to be anyway.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's like having the worst expectation of what could possibly happen kind of mentally prepared you to be strong
Right.
and tough.
Right.
But were there moments when you were like a little bit anxious and worried, like what if it doesn't work out?
Yeah, well, I was always anxious and worried, but not so much like if it doesn't work out, because we were prepared for that.
Right.
Really more anxious and worried that once we made a commitment to do a certain job for somebody, that we actually would deliver and make that person happy.
I see.
Because I think that was key to continuing to actually succeed.
Yeah.
So that's really what I get more anxious about in terms of everything working out so that the client's happy and or my employees happy. Everyone gets out of interacting with me what they thought they were going to get out of that interaction.
Yeah.
That's what made me anxious. I mean, I wasn't really afraid of it not working out.
Yeah. Do you think that your very entrepreneurial spirit and the willingness to take a risk, where do you think that comes from?
So I actually don't think I'm that entrepreneurial in the sense that law is actually a very easy business to get into.
Really?
Meaning it has very little capital investment. Think about it. Like you could start a business with $50,000.
That's true.
You start any kind of halfway, sizable restaurant, it's going to cost multiples of that.
That's true.
So, I think the reason people keep praising me and Steve for Kobre for being, entrepreneurial, et cetera, is because most people who say that are themselves in law.
That's right.
They're like pathologically risk
Do
averse,
it,
right?
right.
So we never really think we took really that much risk.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when you first started out, I heard that you were working at Steve's home.
Yeah.
In the kitchen.
Yeah, with our home computers.
I see. Wow, how was that like?
So it's actually not that stressful
Yeah.
because you had no expenses.
Right.
The firm firm number was actually his home phone. And it actually was his kitchen phone.
Right.
He actually only had one line, but we actually had a phone like on the wall in his kitchen, like those old phones.
Oh, yeah.
So on top of it, his wife was working, and he had a newborn baby,
Oh, wow.
and no person to take care of the baby for periods of time. So we were actually taking care of this newborn baby. And then sometimes people did call, thinking it was a law firm.
Right.
And there was a baby crying in the background
Oh,
that
boy.
one of us was trying to keep quiet. It's actually pretty comical.
Wow, I feel like I'm watching like a movie,
Yeah.
I can kind of like see what you've just described.
Yeah. Well, and then I think one of our first cases, the client wanted to have both of us come to a meeting in an office building.
Oh.
And we couldn't both go because somebody needed to
see-
have the baby.
Right, baby.
So we switched off, actually. And one was with the baby while the other one was at the meeting, and then we switched off in the middle. It's pretty comical.
Oh boy, that's so funny. So how did you get the first client? I hope you got a client within less than 2 years.
Oh, yeah. No, there was a really a lawyer from my old firm, Davis Polk, who had a case with a certain issue that was asset forfeiture, which is Steve and I have a specialty in, criminal asset forfeiture. So we got brought into a case, and we really loved it. It was a great opportunity. I'm always very thankful to that lawyer.
Wow,
Yeah.
must have been such an amazing feeling.
Yeah, no, we were
To-
very excited to actually have a
Wow.
client and all that.
So 15 years later now, you have multiple offices all across the world, I think 10 different locations, 300 and more employees. What are the biggest challenges now of running an international law firm?
So I think that there are so many challenges, but it can all be really summarized in one sentence, which is nobody would have actually hired me to do this job. In other words, because I founded it, the firm grew around me, and I'm co-CEO. But if this business were to shop for a CEO, I probably wouldn't be the person that gets hired. So then what happens is you end up constantly facing all these issues that you don't really know how to solve.
I see.
Commercial issues or personnel issues. And so what we've tried to do is to really try and bring in really outstanding senior people into the firm that are professional managers. So our chief strategy officer is a former McKinsey partner who specializes in professional services to plan out our strategy and our business development. Our top finance person is the former chief financial officer of KPMG USA. So we've really brought on really great people. And our chief operating officer is a former chief operating officer for Europe and East Coast USA for O'Melveny & Myers, very large law firm. So having these really talented senior people have really helped. And yet, they're not the actual CEO. So Steve Kobre and I are the co-CEOs, ultimately, a lot of these things are judgment calls, even
Yeah.
with all this technical help. And I find that very challenging. Everything from financial planning issues to what markets to expand to how to deal with certain types of difficult clients and so forth. Always sort of when I feel like I figured things out, sort of new issues, because the business itself keeps evolving and the industry keeps evolving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are the some of the most rewarding or some of the things that you enjoy the most about what you do now, being an entrepreneur running this international law firm?
So I think the single most rewarding thing is I get to do pretty much what I want almost
Right.
all the time.
That's
So
amazing.
yeah, so even though obviously like large chunks of my day there are things I have to do, it's still what I want because I put myself in that position.
Right.
Nobody forced me to do it.
Right.
Okay, so what that means is I love international travel, so I pretty much can go where I want. I like litigation. I like fraud and insolvency and litigation that are international cases involving fraud and misconduct. So I get to work on that all the time. I used to do a lot of work in Europe and UK, but now I do a lot of my work in Asia, and I love being in Korea where I spend a lot of my time. So I think it's the freedom to really do what I want and be able to change what I do depending on what my interest is in a given month. That's really the most rewarding aspect of it.
Wow. And I heard that when you open up new offices, you opened in locations where you want to visit.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
You must meet so many people all the time. How do you remember people and how do you maintain and grow relationships?
Yeah, so I certainly don't remember everybody, but I think the wrong approach toward networking is trying to just collect a lot of business cards
Right.
and thinking you're networking because you're just meeting a lot of people superficially,
That's right.
and then constantly thinking about what you want from them, constantly thinking you're going to go ask people for help or
Right.
for handouts, right? I think that's the vast majority of people's definition of networking. I think the word itself kind of connotes a kind of lack of genuine feeling about the
I don't
situation.
like the word
Right.
networking
Right.
either. Mhm.
So I think you have to examine like what are you actually trying to accomplish? Like why are you spending time with people who are not your family or closest of friends? For what purpose? Okay, and obviously as in any human relationship of any kind, there's some mutual benefit involved.
Right.
Even if it's emotional as opposed to monetary. But leaving that, I think trying to articulate, well, why are you meeting new people? And I think it's for people you meet that you feel you have no commonality with in terms of shared interests or you're in no shared kind of future situation where you might collaborate together or help each other. I don't blame people for not really remembering them and not really following up with them or keeping track of them. But if you're doing networking with the goal of trying to meet people that you can either learn new things from or you can collaborate with, or thinking in some future situation there may be an opportunity to help each other or to learn from each other, I think then you become actually really interested in those people. And so it's not like you have to go and try and like be best friends with everybody and learn everything about each person, but if there's something interesting about a person, either about what they do or ideas they have, I actually become interested in it. And I also think like, well, if there's something that they need out of life in terms of either ideas or connections, et cetera, that I can help with, that actually creates that commonality that really is the basis for eventually it can be a friendship, it can be a good professional acquaintanceship, et cetera. So I think you really have to enjoy it.
I see.
You really have to enjoy kind of creating these new connections. And I think for people who don't really enjoy it and they regard it really as a kind of like a artificial exercise of pretending to like people you really don't,
Right.
I don't blame them for not wanting to do it because who wants
Yeah.
to be pretending all the time?
Right, exactly. So it has to be sincere, there has to be a genuine interest in getting to know a person and developing that relationship. 'Cause you can't be faking it all the time, right?
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
also, if every hour you spend with somebody you don't actually like takes away from your happiness, obviously, because
That's
nobody
a good
would
point.
actually have a goal of spending time with people they don't like, by definition, right?
Right.
So if your goal is, whatever your goal is, if it's to get what you want, which is the very definition of goal seeking, right? Then, it may be that you end up having to spend time with people you don't like to get certain other goals. But in terms of networking, there's so many people in the world. There's no reason you should be networking with people you don't like.
That's right.
Okay? So even if you have to be in an uncomfortable situation with people you don't know, there's some subset of people that you actually will like or have some commonality with.
That's right.
So when several years ago, so every year I try to come up with new rules for how I conduct my everyday life.
Really?
And one of my rules I came up with several years ago was I will not have dinner or a weekend meal with somebody unless I actually really like them. That doesn't have to be, they don't have to be like a close friend, but
Yeah.
if it's a purely commercial interaction, then it'll be a weekday lunch or a weekday breakfast. And I think this has made a huge impact on my perception of my own happiness, because
Wow.
this means on weekends or every evening, if I'm going to have a meal with somebody, I actually look forward to it because there's
That's
some
great.
element of it I'm actually enjoying.
Yeah. How did you come up with this rule?
I think it's important to always be honest with yourself about everything in your life.
Yeah.
And I think I realized I was having dinner with a lot of commercial contacts because I just didn't have enough time in my day. And then I was thinking, well, what am I actually getting out of in terms of commercial yield versus the amount of impingement on my personal time that represented, and is that a worthwhile trade-off?
Right, I see.
And so, I think I realized that I was paying too high of a price for those
Ah.
dinners and weekend meals.
I see, got it. So this is your rule for this year?
Just from then on, I think it was age 40 I imposed that rule.
Wow.
So for the last 8 years.
Are there any other rules you could share with us?
I have numerous, I think I would say. I basically work out every day unless I'm either sick or it's impossible because of travel.
Wow.
So usually that ends up being anywhere between 4 to 6 times a week. But I actually just make it like brushing my teeth. Like it just will get done.
Wow.
And
So
there's
you work
no-
out in the morning?
So I've actually found that over time that I work out best in late morning, and this is part of how goal seeking. It's all like a system where it can all support itself.
Yeah.
Meaning, the more freedom I've gotten in my life, there are very few. The easier it is to pursue all my other goals.
That's
So
right.
while I'm actually extremely busy, I work probably 60 to 80 hours a week, easily. The situation I've created on purpose is I don't necessarily have to be at a place at a certain time unless I put myself in that situation.
That's right.
So I deliberately create a situation where around like 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. I can basically do whatever I want. I don't have to be anywhere. And I really enjoy working out around that time. So that's how I've structured myself everywhere I go. So I usually go to London or Seoul or New York, besides New York. And each place I kind of have a whole structure. I have a gym. I create that time for myself. And I think these little things add up a lot to give you that sense of control and happiness.
Yeah.
And I think, especially if you're Korean, where unlike, let's say, if you're Latino, where you're kind of intuitively know how to make yourself happy. If you're Korean, I think you have to actually consciously figure out how to make yourself happy every day
I think that's
by
true.
structuring yourself in this way.
Right. I think a lot of Koreans have a hard time figuring out what makes us happy, and probably has a lot to do with cultural aspects of things or parental or societal expectations.
Yeah, that's right. Just like social skills, I think
Yeah.
making yourself happy and understanding what makes you happy and unhappy is actually a learned skill.
How do you understand what makes you happy?
I think, again, it's just sort of being honest with yourself. So I think part of the problem, another impediment to happiness, I think, is if you try to fit into another person's ideal, including societal ideals.
So true.
So I'd say every one of us regards ourselves as a good person.
Yeah.
So, and they regard their life as almost like a drama where they're the protagonist. So they're like the good person. Nobody thinks I'm the villain in the
Right.
drama, right?
Right.
Or I'm a bit player that nobody cares about. So once you conceive of yourself as a good person, there are all these ideals that you think you're supposed to live up to.
Yeah.
You're supposed to do certain things, not do certain things. And then you spend most of your time, especially if you're Korean, feeling guilty you can't live up to those ideals.
That's right.
Because they're ideals because almost nobody can actually achieve them. That's why
Right.
they're ideals.
Right.
So I think one of the great things about kind of getting older and having the self-awareness is I actually don't try to achieve a lot of ideals.
Huh.
So if it's something where I'm really excited about and I really want to do it, I'll do it. But I think for example, so there are people who feel guilty that they are not, say, doing more for charity. There are people who are feeling guilty they're not doing more for friends, etc. I basically think, well, there's a certain limit that I've imposed about how much I'm willing to do for charity or for my friends. And then beyond it, I actually don't feel guilty about it at all. Because I know I have to put certain limits because I have a finite amount of time and money, right? So am I the best person I could be? No, but that's not one of my goals, to be the best person I can be.
Yeah.
I think once you accept all your own flaws, once you accept sort of all the parts of your personality that are not ideal,
Right.
I think you can actually live really harmoniously with yourself. I think being nice to yourself and accepting yourself is actually really hard for Koreans too.
It's very, very hard.
Yeah.
So how did you figure that out? Because you've lived a path of, good school and good job and good profession, and could have been just easy to continuing on that road. But yet you constantly, were reflecting back, learning more about yourself.
Well, I think, especially for all the young people listening to this,
Yeah.
a lot of things in life, to get them, you actually do have to incur a lot of unhappiness up front. So it wasn't like in my 20s, I was just running around doing whatever the hell I wanted, or
Right.
going to work out at 11 a.m. for 3 hours.
Yeah.
But I knew that there were certain things I needed to do to try and get to where I want to be. I think many people have that quality. I think the problem is a lot of people, especially immigrants, feel that just simply working hard
Yeah.
and sacrificing themselves to some institution is actually going to somehow yield rewards.
Right.
Again, that's also kind of giving up on controlling your own life, because you're just thinking, well, if I put a lot of time and energy into this institution, somehow they'll figure out what makes me happy and give it to me.
That's right. I
Right.
think that's how a lot of us think, right?
Yes. So I think if you're sacrificing, you have to sacrifice smart, as opposed to just sacrifice with blind faith that other people will figure out that you sacrifice and somehow pay you back.
Yeah. How did you know at such an early age that that's not how you want to live, Go work for some big institution and have them figure it out for me? Because I think most of us don't even think about it, and we just do it because that's what everybody else does
Yeah.
around us.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually really love kind of deconstructing people and myself
Yeah.
and value systems. I think one of the interesting things about college was really opened my eyes to, for example, I was what's called a social studies major at Harvard, which that sounds kind of like you're reading maps and memorizing like capital cities, but it's actually a really interesting field where you try to understand like why are value systems a certain way. Now, why is it considered good in one society for there to be a huge, let's say, age difference between a man and a woman?
Yeah.
Either way, right?
Right.
And then why is it in another society it's considered really bad
Yeah.
and shameful, right?
Right.
And trying to deconstruct why values arise. There's usually an underlying necessity that created a value, but then even after the necessity disappears, the values perpetuate themselves.
I see.
And so there's always a lag between the value system and necessity.
That's right.
So once you kind of see how it's put together, you are able to let go of just blind belief or value systems and see how things are constructed and kind of construct your own value system to pursue what you want.
Yeah. Wow, this is fascinating. I wish we could go on and on
Yeah.
and on, but there's more questions I want to
Yeah.
ask you. So you described a little bit about how you were able to create your own schedule, and you usually work out late morning. So what does your typical day look like, if there is a typical day?
Yeah, it's my days are generally similar in terms of schedule wherever I am in the world. So I usually wake up anywhere between 4 and 5 a.m. Wherever I am.
Right, you don't sleep very much.
Yeah, I
since
don't sleep
you're
that
very
much.
young,
Yeah,
right?
although the older I'm getting, I'm starting to sleep
How
more.
many hours of sleep do you get every night?
Now it depends on the night, but usually 4 or 5 hours. But
Wow.
when I was younger, I would sleep maybe 2 or 3 hours a night.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Pretty regularly. Yeah.
Okay, so you wake up at 4 or 5.
Yeah, and then I pretty much look at my emails immediately because the problem is that the business runs 24 hours a day. There's actually no time when Kobre Kim's actually closed.
That's right.
So there's always something happening. So no matter when it is, when I wake up, there are issues that I have to deal with. Now, luckily, because the place is larger and there are more people, usually nothing urgent in the sense of it's not like everybody was waiting for me, but I do have to weigh in and just monitor things. So I end up working usually an hour or two, catching up on emails and things of that sort. And then I usually just take like a 30-minute break to go eat breakfast, and then and work some more really.
Yeah.
And then I go work out, and then in the afternoon I usually reserve for like actual meetings with clients or internal meetings and so forth. And then I try to have dinner with somebody I like. So that's my routine pretty much everywhere I am.
Wow. Do you think, is there a habit or something you do regularly that you think contributed to your success?
So it's going to sound really mundane, but I think it's I keep really detailed lists of all the things that I need to do every day. And so everything from working out
Yeah.
to, once a week I actually watch Spanish drama.
Interesting.
I actually
That's
enjoy
on
it.
your to-do list.
Yeah.
So to-do list is not just for work then, like things that you enjoy and things that you want to do for yourself.
Yeah,
also.
well, everything I do, I enjoy pretty much.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I've cut out things that really cause me like too much discomfort.
Yeah.
But for example, Spanish drama, I used to speak Spanish a lot more when I was doing more Latin America work.
Ah, got it.
Now, not as many opportunities. I don't want to really lose the language, so I really enjoy watching Spanish dramas, for example.
Right.
And so I have everything like that to, I have lists of, once a month, think about these spiritual issues or whatever it is. So I actually really like having all these lists of what I think I should be doing
Yeah.
to make myself happy or to kind of achieve what I want. Also, I help my son and my daughter with their homework pretty much every night, no matter where I am in the world.
Wow.
So I schedule that in as
Do
well.
you like Skype with them or FaceTime them?
Yeah, I
or-
FaceTime with them or use Google Drive to edit their essays and things of that sort.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I really enjoy that too. But
Yeah. What are some of the things that's on your list that you are doing or want to be doing to make yourself happier?
So I would say, these are all like, the examples I gave are more like things to do every week, or
Yeah.
the goal is, if I'm editing my son's essay, to get it done by that week, etc. But I have sort of other longer term goals I try to think about. So I've thought about maybe spending more time in Latin America eventually,
I
which
see.
is why the Spanish drama is part of a
Right,
long-term
right.
workflow to try and achieve that.
Yeah.
And then I've also considered briefly whether at some point if I leave the legal profession,
Ah.
what I might want to do.
Yeah.
And so I have a bunch of very interesting ideas, everything from incredibly mundane
Right.
to completely insane. And I think of like what I might want to do to try and put myself in a position to be able to move to one of these models.
Yeah.
So I have, at one point I was considering whether I might want to, after I retire, go to Oktoberfest, which I've been to many times,
Yeah.
and actually become a German singer. So I actually have been studying Oktoberfest songs.
Wow.
Not that I don't spend that much time in it, but I figure
Yeah.
if that's ever an option, not to do for like my entire retirement, but let's say I
Right.
wanted to do that for 3-4 years
Yeah.
in like one of those Oktoberfest bands. I wanted to give myself that optionality, so I have a little German course that I bought, and then the German songs, etc. And I have studied those from time
Yeah.
to time. So I have a lot of little projects like that that amuse me,
Yeah.
that are more long term.
That sounds so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most people think that you probably don't have enough time in a day to do the work because you have this amazing international law firm that's essentially running 24 hours a day, but you make time for yourself. to
Yeah,
do
I think
fun
you have
projects.
to make time to have these long term projects
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the otherwise, if you don't have goals of where you want to end up
Yeah.
at specific times in your life,
Right.
you're going to basically put it in other people's hands, or really nobody's hands. It'll
That's
just
right.
happen randomly.
Yeah. So you've achieved so much. What is your new dream or the next dream?
It's to create more and more freedom for myself,
I see.
which then will allow me to just fill it with other content, everything from spending time with my kids, or one thing I thought was, well, maybe after my kids go to college, maybe I'll take more trips with them. So another kind of project I have is I take a trip with my daughter. Well, I take a lot of trips with my son because he does fencing. I take him everywhere. But I take a trip with my daughter once a year. We've been doing it ever since she was 6. She's 14 now.
Yeah.
Done 8 of them. And I plan these father-daughter trips a lot of thought as to what she might enjoy and what I might enjoy.
Yeah.
This is another like little project I have. So it's really to fill my life with more content like that.
Yeah.
And I have thought maybe I'll do something a little bit more kind of systematically meaningful than just making myself happy, but I haven't really found anything yet. Yeah.
Is there one thing that you know now that you wish you knew when you were younger?
Probably virtually everything, but
Really?
I'd say the most, if I could time travel back and tell my suffering 19-year-old
Younger
self that was just working all the time and basically stressed out most of the time,
Yeah.
I would say that being happy on a day-to-day basis requires conscious effort. I think some people are just naturally programmed maybe, but I'm not
Right.
one of those people. Or if I was, then Korean culture kind of beat it out of me.
That's
So
right.
I think knowing that it actually requires effort. And if you don't put out the effort, you're actually not going to be happy or achieve your goals. I think
Yeah.
it's, everybody always knows like, well, if to make money or to be promoted, you have to work hard.
Right.
So that everybody understands.
Right.
But I think most people, if they're not achieving their personal goals or they're not happy, they can't really articulate why.
Right.
They think, oh, it's bad luck, or I'm being mistreated, or worse, they think, oh, I didn't work hard enough at my job, etc. When in fact, it's 20, 30 minutes of thinking per day about how you're going to make yourself happy that day,
Yeah.
how you're going to try and work towards your long-term goals, which again is another definition of happy. I wish I had understood this back then. It would have saved myself a lot of stress.
Yeah. So what are some of the things you do on a daily basis to make yourself happier? You talked about some long-term projects that you're working on, but
Yeah.
every day, is there something you do?
Yeah, so I think over time I've just learned what gives me, at very little cost of time,
Yeah.
because I don't actually have a lot of time,
That's right.
right, to make myself happy. So I know like drinking coffee at certain times of the day actually does make me happy. And then most people
Ah,
have that in their
That's
habit, right?
Yeah.
And then I think I actually watch very strange YouTube videos.
Really? Like
I-
what?
So everything from, I love videos about like old style Korean restaurants in like regional
Interesting.
parts of Korea.
Where you grew up?
Yeah, that's right. So there's actually a series called, it's kind of translated as the food table of Koreans, 한국인의 밥상. Okay, and there's an old Korean actor, his name is Cheburam, who
Oh, yeah.
narrates it.
Yeah, very
And
famous.
basically, he roams around the Korean countryside, visiting people's homes, and then they cook for him.
Oh, interesting.
And it makes me really happy to watch like 10 minutes of that.
Yeah.
So I allot myself like little bits of it.
Yeah.
And I think, one of my projects is I might want to become Cheburam when I'm old. So that's another hedge beyond the Oktoberfest singer or whatever
Yeah.
it is.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like there could be like a documentary about you and your life and your project. When was the most difficult time for you? What were some of your failures and struggles that you had to overcome to get to where you're now?
So, like I said earlier, I actually feel very lucky because I have really good parents, and I never really ended up feeling like materially deprived. So, I'd say, and then the other things like you could say, I had hardships like I didn't speak the language, I had to learn new language, etc. A lot of people have faced a lot of similar things like that. So,
Yeah.
I don't really regard there was any like big issue. I mean, I feel very lucky. I've always been very healthy, and at least the way that the educational system defined intelligence when I was growing up, which I think is different from how they define intelligence today.
Yeah.
But basically, the ability to acquire, remember information, and repeat it.
Right.
I just was born at the right time because I had that skill at the time.
Yes.
So in many ways, I feel like there's a saying in Wall Street that repeated often that I'd rather be lucky than smart.
Yeah.
So I feel like I was lucky in a lot of ways. So there's nothing I can point to say, oh, this is like something I messed up, or I feel really bad I didn't have this. But I do think that probably the times in my life when I felt kind of emotionally like, oh, wow, like I really messed up, or I really didn't do the right thing, was times when I regretted not spending enough time with people I really love. So I think for people who have not really had like a loved one die, they don't really understand what this means.
Right,
But like
right.
when my grandmother died, who was really like a mother to me,
Right.
I realized like I hadn't spent enough time with her, and I'd been so busy with all these things in my life, and I knew why. Obviously, everyone's got this, but
Yeah,
those are things that like once you realize you made a mistake, you can actually never go back and fix it.
that's right.
You know, if you feel like you ate too much and now you're fat, you can get yourself to go on a diet, right?
Right.
Or you were lazy and you kind of, got a bad grade, you can just work harder for the next semester.
That's right.
With people that you love, that you didn't spend enough time with, and then
Yeah.
they're either die or they leave your life,
Yeah.
you can never fix it. And then at the end of your life is just like an amalgamation of all these moments.
That's
so the
right.
more moments like that you regret that you can't fix,
Yeah.
it devalues your entire life in the aggregate. So
Right.
it's a cold way of saying, like, you should spend more time with people you love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But oftentimes even though when people, are asked what's the most important thing in your life, people usually say family.
Yeah.
But rarely do we make family a priority because work often takes priority,
Right,
right?
right.
So how do you prioritize spending time with the people that you love over doing other things like work?
Yeah. So I've done two things because everyone says it's a balance, and
Yeah.
it's like there's a whole common package of things you're supposed to say
Right.
about it. So I acknowledge all that. It's a balance, your constant struggle, and blah blah
Yeah.
blah. But there's actually two things I did to deal with that issue because I knew it wasn't going to go away.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the first is whenever I am able to say be with my kids,
Yeah.
I try to really carve out intense time with them. So instead of just being around them and doing other things, I try to take a trip with my daughter
Right.
or really spend time talking to them or something like that to make it quality. I think it just takes a little effort, but it doesn't take that much more time.
Right.
So I do that consciously. And when I'm, say, in New York, I actually don't go to the office unless I actually have to,
Yeah.
if they're home. Okay. So that's made a huge difference in accumulating. The other thing is just to be honest with yourself about what you are. So whenever you decide to work or go on a business trip rather than be with, let's say, your kid, you're making a conscious decision that something's more important than the other.
Ah.
Okay. And if you don't understand this about yourself, then you're going to feel guilty constantly about whatever it is you're not doing. So if you're, I think a lot of women especially have the opposite issue, which is they have a successful career, they have all these demands at work, and yet they feel all this responsibility at home.
Of course.
And then when they're spending time with their kids, everyone around them is acting like, oh, you should be happy, you're being a great mother, but the whole time they're stressed out
Yeah,
that there are all
feeling
these things at
guilty.
work
That's
that they're
right.
falling behind on.
Yeah, guilty everywhere.
Right, that's right. And so constantly people are feeling guilty.
Yeah.
And guilt is a feeling that comes from a mismatch between expectation and reality.
That's right.
Stress also, right?
Yeah.
So you have to match these things, and you can only match them by being honest. And I basically decided a long time ago that I'm actually not a person that values my kids above everything else. That I actually, in terms of achieving my personal goals and professional success, there's a degree to which I'm willing to sacrifice my quality as a parent to achieve my other goals.
Ah, I
And
see.
once I was honest with myself about this,
Yeah.
and I actually told my kids this too,
Yeah, how did they react to that?
they've never really known anything else, so they probably think all this is quite normal.
Right.
But I stopped feeling guilty about it.
Ah, wow, that's a hard thing to admit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I guess you had to do that to kind of know yourself better and to be honest so you can make decisions that really align with who you are. And
Yeah, so you have a few choices. You can not admit this to yourself and constantly feel guilty about everything,
Right.
and probably at any time not do what you really want to do, whatever that is, because probably you don't have a definition, so it's constantly changing.
Yeah.
Or you can decide that if you really are someone who values your kids above all else, and I say very rarely to people are people really like that. They like to
Right.
say it, but deep
Say
down, if
it.
you look at your own behavior, you're actually not that good, right?
Right.
But if you really are that, you should actually just sacrifice your job and do a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
And then, maybe you need to get married to somebody you don't really like because they have money, right?
Oh, boy.
That's one way to solve an issue of if you don't want to work and you
Right.
want to be with your kids all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you're not willing to do that, then obviously your own happiness, you want to sacrifice some good time with your kids to pursue some other goals you have, like you want to be with somebody you like. So,
Yeah.
the fact is you can't have it all. Anything you try to get,
Yeah.
you actually have to sacrifice something else. So it's that lack of understanding, again, back to, are you willing to do what it takes to get whatever it is you want?
Right. So not as much as we say we want to do this, we want to do that, or this is important, like how much are we willing to sacrifice or not do something else to achieve what we want?
That's right. And if you describe yourself in some kind of laudable way, like,
Yeah.
oh, I want to be a good father, let's be honest, like, is that really the only value you have?
Right.
You know?
What
And-
other values are important in your life?
Are more important,
More
actually.
important in your life.
You
I
can't
see.
say it's all important, I want to balance it, because,
Yeah.
you know, there's only 24 hours in a day.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
obviously, the more of something you do, that you're going to do less of something else.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that. I think a lot of people needed to hear it. They're
Yeah.
probably feeling it, but afraid to admit it.
Right.
So we know that nobody succeeds alone and nobody achieves dreams alone. So I want to ask you, who helped you to achieve your dreams? If you can remember a person or two.
So I think a lot of different people along the way. But say probably if I had to choose the three random people, I won't say the top three people because then whoever's not included will feel
Right.
unhappy. So
Yeah.
top three,
Random.
I'd say three random people that
Right.
come to the top of my mind,
Yeah.
but not in order of significance and not even the most significant people. Okay, I'd say the first was my grandmother. But not for like the reasons you would expect. Everyone says like, "Oh, my grandmother gave me all these values, whatever." She actually was a very unusual person. She, I think, even though she grew up in rural Korea, she, I think, from an early age was like quite rebellious. And you know, for example, when she was like 75 or 80, even she watched Michael Jackson videos and learned how to break dance and stuff like that. Yeah, so she's a very unusual person, but.
A Korean grandma.
Yeah. So when I was a kid, as most Korean kids, I was raised by my grandma.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time with her. I think she kind of gave me a worldview that where she really didn't respect any traditions and always like thought about new things, even though she was, you know, she was born like in 1910 or something crazy like 1919, something,
Wow.
some really long time ago.
Yeah.
At a time when Korean society really, if you were a woman, especially in a traditional household, they would really just kind of put you in a little box and
Absolutely.
tell you you can do this and not that. You're almost
Yeah.
like a little, you know, plaything for other
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
But yeah, she really just really had her own mind and her own way of behaving and acting. So that really probably gave me, unbeknownst to myself, a real subconscious comfort with not following other people's instructions necessarily.
I see.
So I think that was really very helpful. And then I'd say another sort of person along the way would be a good friend I had in the army who actually ended up dying in Iraq in a truck bomb attack. Right? And I think the reason that he ended up being significant is that until he died, I actually, the only people I cared about who had died were old people.
Right.
So, my grandmother died, and then like my uncle died, and I love them, and it affects you a lot, and it causes you to, like I said, realize what I told you earlier, which is, certain types of regret you can never fix.
Right.
But when someone old dies, kind of like deep down, you think like, okay, it's supposed to happen at some point,
Yeah.
right? Old people are supposed to eventually pass away.
Right.
But when somebody who's your age or younger
Yeah.
dies, especially suddenly like that, it really ends up affecting your worldview in the sense that you kind of see life more for what it is,
Yeah.
which is there's really nothing at the end that kind of summarizes the whole thing and makes sense. It's really just an accumulation of all these moments that you have.
That's right.
And for that person, that was the end, right?
Yeah.
And then just seeing how the world just moves on. Once obviously his loved ones never forget him and so forth, but the world just moves on, right?
Yeah.
So I think that really ended up kind of allowing me to see more clearly how important it is to have the goal of making yourself happy and so forth,
I
right?
see.
And then I'd say probably in terms of people who helped me, I'm always grateful to the first person who taught me English. Was a person named
Yeah?
Mrs. Brown, who was a tutor.
Where she was when you moved to Miami? She was a
She
teacher?
actually taught me a little bit in Costa Rica.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I couldn't speak it fluently back then,
So
but
when you were like 6 or 7.
yeah, that's right.
Wow.
And she, I think if I had only spoken Spanish at that point, I would have
Yeah.
never really become fluent in English, and it would have really limited my ability to do all kinds of things internationally.
That's right.
Because I think fundamentally, one of my great loves is international travel and international work.
Yeah.
And unless you're fluent in English, it's very hard to achieve. And not impossible,
course.
very hard.
Right.
And it's one of these things where, as I mentioned earlier, like when you have a certain goal, you have to understand like what it takes to actually achieve that goal.
Yeah.
And fluence in English is like an integral part of almost everything that I have now.
That's
And
right.
if I hadn't learned it at that early age, it would have
Yeah.
been really hard later in life.
Yeah.
So
Did you get a chance to say thank you?
no, because I never really found her again. And with a name like Mrs. Brown, I'm definitely never
That's
going to find her
right.
again. Yeah,
Well-
it's like going to Korea and looking for Mr. Kim.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, hope she knows.
Yeah.
So you have achieved such a tremendous level of success, and I'm sure you know and met a lot of success people around you also. So what have you learned about success that you can share with our listeners?
I'd say most people that look successful by the way the society defines them actually are not successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I do litigation.
That's right.
So I represent most of the people I represent are extremely wealthy
That's
or high, sort of have all the trappings of what society regards as success, like power over other people, status, money. I can tell you most of them are pretty miserable. I mean, I see obviously a subset of people who are in litigation, so
Right.
I see like the people in the worst situation.
Right.
But I can definitely tell you that money and power really have only a small relationship to actual happiness and success.
Interesting.
Again, success is really achieving your own goals, not any other definition in my mind.
Yeah.
So I think the best I guess, point about success that I'd want to impart is that you really have to understand the extent to which societal definitions of success and happiness are subconsciously affecting your own definition.
That's right.
And then unless you unpackage that, believe me, when you're like 50 or 60, it's going to get unpackaged for you. And you're not going to like it because you're not going to have control over
Yeah.
those aspects of your life that you need to have control over to achieve your own definition. If you're first trying to come up with your definition,
Yeah.
when you're kind of like almost done with your working life, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah. So gotta really think about that when you're young, right?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
makes a huge difference.
Yeah, yeah. So my last question
Yeah.
to you is, what would be your words of advice to the young generation or people in their early in their careers trying to kind of figure it all out?
Yeah, so I think the most common refrain of people who are young is to follow your heart and do what makes you happy. But usually when people say that, they define it as short-term happiness. And I think that's a terrible mistake because one thing that I find interesting is, with few exceptions, if you haven't figured out by age 40 to 45 how you're going to achieve what you want, and you haven't set up your own situation, it's actually really hard. Not impossible, but it's really, really hard. And to set yourself up in whatever situation you want, I'm not necessarily talking about professional success, but whatever it is you're trying to achieve, I think requires a fair amount of short-term sacrifice in your 20s and 30s.
That's right.
So I think being realistic about how much of your conduct is going to be short-term happiness versus smart sacrifice, like I said earlier, not just going and just doing whatever people say and just pouring all your work into some institution that's not going to necessarily do anything for you other than pay your salary, but having smart sacrifice and understanding you are going to have to incur cost
That's right.
along the way. You know, I think this is really important, and for young people to really feel like, you know, to really be happy throughout your entire life and not just pursue dreams and then it just becomes about trying to preserve flexibility becomes a goal in and of itself.
I see.
Like trying to keep yourself in a state of indecision becomes a goal in and of itself. The problem is the state of indecision that might seem like such an attractive goal in your 20s and 30s
Yeah.
actually is rarely attractive to people in their 40s and 50s.
That's right.
And you're eventually going to get there, and you're going to have probably another 20, 30, well, at least 20 years to work, maybe 30 years to work.
Yeah, especially because we're gonna live till probably like 100 nowadays, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well,
This
thank
has been
you.
such a
No,
pleasure.